Right now, the best fighters on Earth train 6 hours a day. They have nutritionists, physiotherapists, coaches for every discipline, striking coaches, wrestling coaches, jiu-jitsu coaches. They cut weight scientifically. They recover with ice baths and sleep trackers. And they are genuinely terrifying human beings. But here is the question nobody has asked. What would happen if you put one of them in the octagon with a man who had been fighting for survival every single day for his entire life? Not a trained fighter, a hunter, a Neanderthal, a Homo erectus, an ancient human built by 2 million years of brutal natural selection to be the most dangerous thing in the forest. Who wins? And what does the answer reveal about what modern humans have lost? To answer this properly, we need to start somewhere most people never go, not with muscles or bones, with context. What was life actually like for an ancient human? Because understanding what they did every single day is the only way to understand what their bodies were actually capable of. A modern UFC fighter trains hard, 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, with rest days built in, with recovery protocols, with careful periodization to avoid overtraining. An ancient human had no rest days. There was no off-season. There was no recovery week. Every single day they woke up, and the job was the same. Find food. Don't get killed. Come back to camp. That job involved walking between 10 and 20 miles, carrying loads of up to 40 or 50 pounds of meat, firewood, or supplies, climbing, digging, swimming, throwing heavy objects with precision, and occasionally coming into close physical contact with animals that weighed between 500 and several thousand pounds. This wasn't a training program. This was survival. And it built bodies that modern exercise science is only beginning to understand. Let's start with Homo heidelbergensis, the species that lived between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago, the direct ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. When researchers analyzed their skeletal remains, what they found was not a primitive weakling. What they found was a physical specimen that would make most modern athletes nervous. Average height, 5'9" to 6'1". Roughly the same as a modern human, but the bone density was dramatically higher. Homo heidelbergensis bones were so thick and dense that researchers initially mistook some specimens for pathological conditions. They weren't sick. They were just built differently. This bone density tells us something critical about their muscle mass. Bones don't get that dense without enormous mechanical loading, meaning the muscles attached to those bones were generating forces that required bones that thick just to not break. We are talking about muscle mass that modern humans simply cannot achieve naturally, not without pharmacological assistance. Now let's talk about Neanderthals specifically, because Neanderthals are the ancient human species we have the most data on. And what that data shows is one of the most physically impressive species that ever walked the earth. Neanderthal males averaged 5'5" to 5'7", shorter than a modern human male. But what they lacked in height, they more than made up for in everything else. Their skeletal muscle attachment points, the places on bones where muscles anchor, were significantly larger than modern humans, meaning their muscles were both bigger and attached more powerfully. Researchers estimate that Neanderthal upper body strength was roughly equivalent to a modern human male who had been seriously weightlifting for 10 to 15 years, as their baseline, not their peak, their baseline. A study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed the arm bones of Neanderthals and found that their dominant arm was significantly stronger than their non-dominant arm. The same asymmetry seen in professional tennis players and baseball pitchers. people who repetitively generate enormous force with one arm for years. Neanderthals were doing something with one arm repeatedly with enormous force. Researchers believe it was thrusting spears into large animals at close range. The grip strength alone would have been extraordinary. Modern grip strength records are around 250 kilograms of force for the strongest humans ever tested. Researchers estimate Neanderthal grip strength may have exceeded this by a significant margin, simply from the mechanical requirements of their daily activities. Here is something that rarely gets discussed in this context. Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans, not smaller, larger. Average Neanderthal brain volume was approximately 1,600 cubic centimeters. The modern human average is around 1,350. Now, brain size alone doesn't determine intelligence. The structure and organization matter just as much. Neanderthal brains were organized differently from ours. More occipital lobe, the visual processing center. Slightly less frontal lobe, the planning and social reasoning center. What this tells us is that Neanderthals were highly visually oriented. They processed what they saw with extraordinary speed and precision. In a fight, this matters. Reading an opponent's movements, tracking feints and setups, reacting to visual information faster than conscious thought. These are skills that separate good fighters from great ones. And Neanderthals may have had a neurological edge in this specific area. Now here is where it gets really interesting for the UFC comparison, because we can look at the injuries. Ancient human skeletons are full of healed fractures, and the pattern of those fractures tells us exactly how they lived and how they fought. In 2009, researchers analyzed the injury patterns of Neanderthal skeletons and compared them to modern humans with similar injuries. The closest match they found was not soldiers, not construction workers, not farmers. It was professional rodeo riders. Rodeo riders sustain injuries from close physical contact with enormous, unpredictable, dangerous animals at high speed. The Neanderthals were sustaining the same injuries from hunting at close range, charging in on mammoths, grappling with cave bears, stabbing animals that outweighed them by thousands of pounds. These weren't men who sat back and threw spears from a distance. These were men who got close, very close, and held on. We also have direct evidence of ancient human combat, not hunting, actual fighting between humans. Skulls from as far back as 400,000 years ago show fracture patterns consistent with blunt force trauma from other humans, not animals, humans hitting other humans. A study published in 2017 analyzed a skull from Cima de los Huesos in Spain, dating to 430,000 years ago. The skull showed two separate blunt force injuries in almost exactly the same spot. The researchers concluded this was almost certainly homicide. Two blows to the same place from the front. Someone had been in a fight and lost. Forensic analysis of ancient human remains across Africa and Europe shows rates of violent trauma between 15 and 30%, meaning between 1 in 7 and nearly 1 in 3 ancient humans sustained a serious violent injury at some point in their lives. These were not peaceful people. They were people who lived in a world where violence was a regular part of existence, and they survived it, over and over again. Because the skeletons we find are the ones with healed injuries, the healed fractures, the survived wounds. We are looking at the winners. So how did ancient humans actually fight? Not in the movies, not in documentaries. Based on the skeletal evidence and what we know from modern hunter-gatherer groups who still practice traditional combat methods. First, they grappled. Wrestling is the oldest combat sport in human history. Cave paintings in Egypt, dating to 15,000 years ago, show wrestlers in holds that are still used today. The same trips, the same takedowns, the same clinch work. Grappling makes evolutionary sense. When two humans of similar size fight, grappling is how you control an opponent, how you take them to the ground, how you end the fight without necessarily killing your opponent, which in a small tribe was often the goal. You needed the people around you to survive. Killing a rival from your own group over a dispute was expensive. The social cost was enormous. So most fights ended with dominance established, but the loser still alive. Second, striking. Ancient humans had hands built for punching. This is not speculation. In 2015, researchers at the University of Utah published a study arguing that the human hand evolved its specific proportions partly to form an effective fist. The ability to fold the fingers, brace the thumb, and deliver force through the knuckles is unique to humans among primates. Chimpanzees cannot make a proper fist. Their thumb is too short, their fingers too long. A chimpanzee strike is an open-handed slap. Powerful, but not a punch. Humans are the only primate that punches, and the hand structure that allows effective punching appeared in our evolutionary lineage at roughly the same time as the face structure that can absorb punches. Thicker orbital bones around the eye sockets, thicker brow ridges, stronger jaw structure. We evolved both to deliver and to receive blows to the face, which strongly suggests that striking was a regular part of human conflict for millions of years. Third, weapons. Ancient humans were tool users from the very beginning. The oldest known wooden spears date to 400,000 years ago, found in Germany. Perfectly balanced throwing spears as aerodynamically efficient as modern javelins. But in a fight, a spear becomes a staff. A rock becomes a striking weapon. A bone becomes a club. Ancient humans who survived long enough to leave bones were people who understood improvised weaponry. They understood range and leverage and how to use whatever was available. Fourth, endurance. This is the factor most people overlook. A fight that goes deep into the later rounds is fundamentally different from a short explosive exchange. Ancient humans were built for sustained effort over long periods, not sprint performance, sustained pursuit over hours. A fight that goes to the ground and involves grinding grappling for extended periods plays directly into an ancient human's greatest strengths. Now here is where history gives us a direct parallel, because ancient humans didn't just fight for survival. At some point, they started fighting for sport. And the sport they created was essentially the UFC. In 648 BC, the ancient Greeks introduced a combat sport to the Olympic Games. It was called pankration, from the Greek words for all and power. The rules were simple. You could strike, you could grapple, you could choke, you could break limbs. The only things banned were eye gouging and biting. Everything else was legal. This was not a sanitized sport. Competitors died. Fingers were broken deliberately to break grips. Shoulders were dislocated. Men were choked unconscious. And the crowd loved it. The greatest pankration champion in ancient history was a man named Theogenes of Thasos. He competed for over 20 years, winning more than 1,400 contests. He was described by ancient writers as having arms that seemed too long for his body and a grip that no man could break. Another legendary champion, named Polydamas of Scotusa, was said to have killed a lion with his bare hands and stopped a moving chariot by grabbing one of its wheels. These stories are almost certainly exaggerated, but they tell us something about what ancient people valued in a fighter: raw strength, grip, the ability to control another human body through sheer physical force. Sound familiar? But pankration itself was ancient even to the Greeks. They believed it was invented by the hero Heracles. And the techniques they used, throwing clinching ground fighting chokes, were techniques that humans had been using against each other and against animals for hundreds of thousands of years before the Olympics. Pankration wasn't invented in Greece. It was formalized there. The fighting itself is as old as the species. And it wasn't just the Greeks. Almost every ancient civilization developed combat sports. Ancient Egypt had wrestling competitions depicted in paintings dating to 3,500 years ago. Hundreds of wrestlers shown in detailed technical positions. Throws, takedowns, leg trips, sweeps. A complete wrestling system. Ancient Mesopotamia had boxing contests depicted in Sumerian relief carvings dating to 3,000 years BC. Ancient China had Jiao Di, a grappling art that dates back over 4,000 years. Ancient India had Malla Yuddha, a combat wrestling system described in texts over 3,000 years old. The Maori of New Zealand had Mau Rakau, weapons-based combat training that preserved fighting techniques from thousands of years of Pacific warfare. Every culture, every continent, every time period. Wherever humans lived, they developed systems for fighting each other, and they practiced them constantly. The martial tradition is not a specialization. It is a human universal, as old as language, as old as fire. So now let's actually answer the question. How would an ancient human do in the UFC? Let's break it down by category. Strength. So how would an ancient human do in the UFC? The honest answer is better than anyone expects. Strong enough to neutralize most opponents through sheer physical force. Hard enough to absorb punishment that would stop modern fighters. Experienced enough in real violence to not freeze under pressure. Missing only one thing. The accumulated technical knowledge that 10,000 years of organized combat sports have given the modern fighter. Give a Neanderthal 6 months of modern MMA training, and you might have the most dangerous fighter who has ever lived. Because the body was already there. It has always been there. The ancient human who hunted mammoths at close range in the dark with a handheld spear and came home alive was already doing something more physically demanding than anything inside an octagon. We just didn't have a name for it. The fight was already there. It has always been there. It is still in you. Right now. Underneath everything modern life has built on top of it.